first time was in person, obviously. And I'm going to assume that we have a similar crowd, right? So people who may be getting started in InfoSec, looking to go into that world. And so I wanted to take a minute and sort of talk through how I got into the industry and maybe a little bit about how I see people being successful before I get into the bulk of my talk. So I got into InfoSec as the result of being extremely curious about how to watch NFL football. So as a young kid, basically, looked into doing some reverse engineering into the satellite encryption, the encryption systems that DirecTV and Dish Network used, and basically spent some time poking around there. And I share that not to say, hey, I'm some elite hacker dude or whatever. I was part of a very large community that was looking into reverse engineering crypto that was protecting content. But what I'll tell you is that my secret to getting into this industry was finding something I was interested in, finding a technology that I could get into, and then sort of rolling it from there. Now, I will tell you, don't go and do anything illegal or stupid. I was very fortunate in the fact that when I got involved, within a very short amount of time, some folks in federal law enforcement reached out to me and said, hey, we think it's a bad idea that you're doing what you're doing, but maybe you can come work for us. And I got the chance to go and do some things working for law enforcement that I never could have done on my own. Well, I could have done, I probably would have ended up in jail. And so that's the early 90s, right? So, now it's 30 years ago that I was doing that work. And so now let's sort of roll forward about, what does it take for someone to do well in InfoSec today and doing cybersecurity well? And the first thing I'll tell anybody is you need to make sure that you are an excellent technologist. You very rarely can do security well if you don't know the security stack, the technology stack soup to nuts. And so a lot of folks who want to do well in cybersecurity oftentimes get guided to say, okay, well, know about this particular attack or know about this particular monitoring technologies. But my strong recommendation to everybody first is to go out and make sure that you are extremely strong in a particular technology. And for those who are coming new into the industry, go and focus on those emerging technologies. So for example, if I were an 18-year-old kid today and, so if I go back in time and advise myself, what would you do today if you were starting from scratch? I would basically say, technologies like Starlink that SpaceX is coming out with, there's going to be a whole range of cybersecurity problems that come as the result of ubiquitous satellite internet. And so I think there's going to be a ton of really interesting stuff that's there. And any emerging technology, right? Whether it be relating to robotics or something like that, those are going to be areas that that I would invest my time in to be a great technologist, and then come in to do cybersecurity on top of it. So if you have any questions about directions you should go, feel free, reach out to me through LinkedIn. Always happy to answer those questions. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. So let's get into the meat of this presentation. I started a business in March. I was I was actually living in Europe at the time, and the European COVID lockdown was extremely more aggressive than the United States one. I actually had to get a State Department letter to get out of Luxembourg and to move my family back to the United States. And so for a period of time, it was illegal to wander the streets of Luxembourg, and you were fined 10,000 euros if you were out on the street. And so I basically said, okay, well, if I'm locked down and business is kind of slow, and what am I going to do? So I said, what would be an interesting security problem to solve? And so in conjunction with the pandemic, there's this massive movement of companies away from their traditional IT systems and traditional infrastructure towards software as a service delivered things, including Microsoft 365, but other things like Zscaler and other cloud-based delivery platforms. And so I said, what could I do to really dig into the security of it? And so dig into the security. Well, dogs dig into things and say, oh, I'll start a company that's named after a dog. My favorite dog in mythology is Sirius. all of the good serious domain names are taken, so I'll name it Sirix with an X. And so I started a research project, formed a company, and what I'm going to walk you through is sort of the trajectory of how we've gone about trying to improve the security of data relative to the massive movement of data into Microsoft 365. And you'll see here the IANS logo. In addition to being the founder and CEO of Sirius, I'm also an IANS faculty member, so I do a lot of my research and presentations in conjunction with them. All right, so if we think about the situation is that Microsoft benefited from a massive windfall. The 2020 pandemic drove 22% growth for them as far as the number of customers, and it drove 250 million paid seats of Microsoft Teams. That's 250 million people who are now registered and signed up and paying for a Microsoft Teams license. I don't think we've seen that level of growth since, I don't know, the very, very early days of the internet. And so the 2020 fundamentally changed the way we collaborate. Heck, we're doing this video conference over Zoom because we can't meet in person. And so the irony of this is that Microsoft 365, what is the Microsoft 365 platform today, was originally developed as a way to try to keep Microsoft Exchange Server customers happy. And for full disclosure's sake, I worked at Microsoft from 99 until 2006. And so I was on the team that built the first application service provider version of Exchange. It was called Hosted Exchange for ISPs. So imagine running an internet service provider on Exchange in the year 2000. That was an interesting project. But we basically, when I was at Microsoft, we had created this online hosting version because so many people were so dissatisfied with Exchange. And so generally the way people get into Microsoft 365 is because they're tired of hosting Exchange, and they maybe tried G Suite and it just wasn't good enough for their users. And so they end up saying, okay, we're going to go to Exchange Online, let's go. So whether you got there as the result of the pandemic windfall or you got there as the result of Exchange Online, hey, the majority of enterprises in the United States and the United Kingdom, at least, are now Microsoft 365 users. So what do you get? When you sign up for this service, you get Exchange Online, you get Microsoft Teams, you get OneDrive, SharePoint, Skype for Business. Wait a second, Skype for Business and Teams? Yeah, you get both. And there are configurations for both of those that impact your security posture. You get My Analytics, Yammer, Microsoft 365 Business Voice. Wait a second, there's a voice service in this thing? But most importantly, you have now inherited all of the security problems relating to Azure Active Directory. And this is something that most organizations have not thought through. But wait, there's more. When you sign up for Microsoft 365, here are the additional services that you get. Things like Planner, Power Automate, Microsoft Teams, Stream, Delve, Sway. These are applications that may not resonate to you as far as a branding perspective, but they all are ways by which attackers can enumerate your Microsoft 365 platform and potentially exfiltrate data to bypass your data loss protection controls. And so each one of these services has certain security configurations that you should be aware of. So what we did in my research time is we used a combination of Microsoft PowerShell scripts and the Graph API to enumerate what are these configurations? And even in the basic or the E3 level of Microsoft 365, we found over 7,500 individual settings. Some of these are not available through the UI. You can't access them through the administrator portal. You only can interact with them through PowerShell or the Graph API. And so when we took a look at these for high security organizations, we believe that as many as 30% of these 7,500 settings could have some impact on your organization's data or identities. Now, not only is that a massive hill to climb to start, but Microsoft is releasing more apps every month, and sometimes more security features within the apps they have released. So for example, this month alone, Microsoft has released 12 different security settings for Azure Active Directory, and that's just at the P1 level. P2, we've found over 40 different settings that they've released. And these all are just keep getting piled on top of the stack that you already have. So let's take a minute here and we say, okay, well, why should I care about this? Why is this something that that is something I should be spending time on? Let's talk through some of the incidents that we've had to clean up over the last couple of years. So the first one is a global admin account takeover. So this incident started with a browser exploit, and we believe it was probably opportunistic. So global admin surfing from their computer gets caught in someone's net. Browser exploit pops. The attacker essentially gets the ability to install a keystroke logger to get credentials. Software as a service, that's a problem, right? Because you have to interact with the software as a service through a browser. So now the attacker has the credentials. But luckily, this organization had multi-factor authentication set up. They had their Microsoft Authenticator taken care of. Oh, but actually, this global admin's Microsoft Authenticator was installed on a vulnerable iPhone. The attackers went to GitHub, dumped a set of remote exploitation tools that were available for his version of iOS, targeted him with those remote exploitation tools, and then captured the Microsoft Authenticator keys. Now, the downside of using soft tokens is that the encryption keys that drive the integrity of that soft token have to be installed in the iOS keychain or in the Android key store. That means that if someone gets a remote exploit vulnerability, that they can clone that authenticator key set. So now the attacker has the username and password from the browser exploit. They have successfully cloned the Microsoft Authenticator, so now they are the global admin, right? There's no way to tell the two apart. And what these particular attackers did is they turned on all of the Exchange Online PowerShell commands to harvest information from the CEO, CFOs, and other senior leaders of this company. We believe this was done mainly for financial market arbitrage. So in this case, the bad guys came in and were looking for access to pre-market data, which would they then use to trade. This was an organization that was very involved in merger and acquisition activity. And so we believe that this was all done for financial gain. So while the beginning started as opportunistic, that opportunistic attacker probably sold their foothold onto a more sophisticated group. The sophisticated group then went and exploited the additional vulnerabilities to gain access to the global admin account. This went on for over 6 months. So this was a long-term foothold that they had that they were abusing because of poor hygiene on the device, poor global admin processes. And so there is a whole bunch of problems here. So there's one case, right? Next case. A few months ago, the SANS Institute had to disclose that they had a leakage of some of their customer data. Now, I don't know this for a fact, and this is just all hearsay, but through the grapevine, it was suggested that that SANS incident began with a Microsoft plugin, one of the plugins that you can install in an Outlook or Teams or whatever. And so whether that's true or not, we have found several instances where malicious plugins, well, where plugins have been used as a flexing vector by attackers. So the plugin may not be malicious in and of itself, but because the plugin is so poorly engineered and has not properly gone through any sort of vetting process, it's essentially a malicious plugin because it ends up being the vector by which the attacker flows through. We've seen one case where Microsoft 365 Power Automate was used to clone ShareDrive and OneDrive repositories and then send the data out through a plugin to a third-party site. So you have to think about what are you really getting in bed with when you go down the plugin route. We've seen tons of exploits against the Microsoft Graph Data API. So the Microsoft Graph Data API gives you access to do all sorts of interesting things, to query address books, to get access to email, to get access to SharePoint sites. But when it's not properly configured, it essentially becomes an open exploitation gateway to get access to data without proper authentication or authorization. And we've got dozens of other incidents that we've helped to clean up. So if we think about trying to prioritize these incidents, where's the place? Well, let's take a moment to talk about Azure Active Directory. You have to have it. You can't turn on Microsoft 365 without some form of Azure Active Directory connection. And even in a one-way sync situation, Azure Active Directory creates vulnerabilities that most organizations are not properly resourced to take care of. So if your eyes are starting to glaze over here and go, oh man, too much stuff, whatever, what's the bottom line? You know, you should treat Azure Active Directory as if it were another service that needs to be hardened. And that means that the service to which it's connected, your on-premise Active Directory, needs to have the latest versions, the latest patches installed, the latest functional version. And so what I'm telling most people is if you are not on Azure AD, if you are not on Active Directory version 2019, you need to get there as soon as possible. There are legacy vulnerabilities in 2008, 2012, 2016 that create specific vulnerability sets that most organizations are not equipped to detect and respond to. So the best thing to do is just get that on-prem Active Directory upgraded and to the latest version, and that's going to be the easiest way to solve this problem. And so among IANS customers, they have 200 customers around the United States, most of them fairly sophisticated information security teams. Even in those security teams, in clients with sophisticated security teams, they would categorize their move to Azure AD as more of ready, fire, aim, not ready, aim, fire, right? Essentially, they were kicking and screaming into Azure AD. No one really took a good look at the security policies, and then it's like, okay, we're here, whatever. There's a really great resource that I've linked to here in the slides, and if you do a Google search for Azure AD Connect for Red Teams, it's an article written by Adam Chester. Really great content there about how to leverage weaknesses in Active Directory to connect as an unauthorized user, an unauthenticated user, to create an account, to elevate privilege, and to eventually get to global admin if a series of vulnerabilities exist. That's the worst case scenario, right? Why would you ever get into bed with something where someone can go from unauthenticated user to global admin without having to go through some sort of process? And if you've used the Azure AD defaults, that's what can happen. So if there's just one thing you can do about Azure AD, if you don't have time to upgrade your on-prem AD, if you don't have time to read the white paper by Adam Chester, the number one thing to do is block legacy auth. Yes, by default, Azure AD supports good old NTLM, that completely reversible, not a great protocol to use for authentication and authorization. And so by blocking legacy auth, you can help solve a lot of these problems. And as I've stated on the slide here, we could spend an entire hour on this topic alone. Azure AD is so fundamentally important to the future of your cloud-based security, you need to dedicate those resources. So let's talk a little bit about things on a more broad basis. So when you think about prioritizing policies, we've talked a little bit about Azure AD from a fundamental perspective, from a protocol or a base configuration perspective, but then you have to go through the process of actually thinking about how do you manage privileges of those people too. So here's just my, quick and dirty list of things that you should be checking to make sure that you're not vulnerable to some of the attacks that are going on inside of Azure AD. So the first one is you want to delink a user's day-to-day account from the global admin account. So you should make sure that the daily driver account that they have is that they use for email and OneDrive and all of the collaboration stuff, that account is not a global admin account. You want to make sure that a global admin account does not have email sending privileges, does not have the ability to log into Teams. That should be a completely separate account, and in my opinion, it should use an MFA system that is separate from the MFA from the rest of the platform. You can do that through conditional access policies, where you can basically, okay, for this group of global admin users, I'm going to make them use a YubiKey instead of the Microsoft Authenticator, and that's my preferred approach, is to basically use a hardware token instead of a soft token for multi-factor for global admin rights. There's a setting inside of Azure AD that you can set to basically notify all admins if any admin changes their account. And so that becomes sort of a method to let other admins watch for the relative integrity of an account. You need to make sure that you enforce at least an authenticator code for a password reset, but preferably require a full multi-factor authentication login. You want to make sure that you disable SMS and phone call authentication for those global admin accounts, disable self-service password reset for those accounts, restrict access to the Azure AD portal so that they have to go through certain network controls before they're able to get to the Azure AD admin portal. And then you want to set a notification email for admin changes to all admins in the group, right? So if a person joins, everyone's notified to say, hey, there's a new global admin in the group. Is that something you want to do? So I'll take a quick break here and just say, are there any questions about Azure AD. And CornCon people, like, do we have people in the session, or am I just talking to myself? How many people do we have attending? Let's see here.
And we have 11 participants,
Okay.
and I'm checking Discord to see if we have any questions. Nothing in track 2. So, oh wait, one just popped up in the Q&A here. This is a question from Dan. Are you willing to share the presentation?
Yes. So how are you, what's going to be the easiest way to do that? Should I send it to you? Should I post a link?
So we are recording right now, and the hope is to get them uploaded somewhere, maybe to the website or YouTube.
Okay. So if you want the presentation, I will share my contact info. Send me an email. I see, we don't have a ton of people here, and so I'll make sure to share my email. Send me an email. I'll send it to you direct. But for the CornCon folks, happy to share it where you can publish it wherever you publish the video.
Perfect. Thank you. Aaron, do you see the Q&A chat
yes,
box?
I do.
Okay.
I do. So, okay, so it looks like implementing into an M365 Premium. Okay, so let's talk. I see Nate T. In addition to those security steps, I would assume you would require a hard token for global admins. That is correct. So my preference is to completely avoid soft tokens or any SMS driven authentication, and use things like YubiKey or Google Titan Key to make sure that global admins have that level of integrity associated with their identity. And so then Dan, I see what about zero logon vuln and Azure AD? So that white paper from Adam Chester walks through exactly how that is exploited. And then from a hardening perspective, basically if you take a look at what I just presented, plus the upgrade of your on-prem AD, it helps to reduce the likelihood that the zero login vulnerability can be exploited. Now, the downside is that Microsoft is shifting a lot of their functionality fast enough where we have seen situations where problems like zero login get reintroduced because of changes that Microsoft makes within the Azure AD environment. And so that's why it's really important. One of my IANS faculty colleagues, John Strand, the Black Hills InfoSec team published a tool that will go out and scan to see if you've got Azure AD problems. And so if you want to go and start looking for things, I'd recommend downloading the Black Hills InfoSec Azure AD scanning tool, and that will help you solve for some of these vulnerabilities as well. Okay, so we'll just start live. Okay, all right. Okay, so it looks like we've covered most of the questions so far. Feel free to keep dropping questions in there if things come up. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about attack surface reduction here. So let me share my screen again. All right, so this may sound dumb, and it's basic, but disable unused apps. It shocks me how many people sign up for Office 365, Microsoft 365, and don't take the step to say, I don't want to use Yammer. I don't want to use Delve. I don't want to use, whatever stuff is out there. If there is not a legitimate business purpose for why you should be using something, shut that stuff off. Like it pains me. So one of the ways that I learned the really hard way about security at Microsoft when I was working there is we had to develop a method to train the Microsoft developers to do security better because of the awful situation we were in. I was responsible in 2003 for cleaning up all of the blaster worm and the slammer worm and everything that was going on. And so we went back to the developers and we developed a mantra called SD3. SD3 stood for secure by design, secure by default, and secure in deployment. Well, right now, Microsoft is violating all of those principles that we work towards for SD3, because when you turn on Microsoft 365, everything's enabled. And it should just be the opposite. It should be you get to enable the things you want to do, but instead it's like, here's all this stuff, because Microsoft is trying to compete on a global basis to get more people to use their platform, so they're trying to make it easier to use. One of the other key things I should have mentioned, you want to make sure that you enable the Azure AD security defaults. Wait a second. If it's a default, why do I need to enable it? Well, what ended up happening was too many people were having problems with enabling it, and so Microsoft disabled it by default, and now you have to go turn it on. Some additional key configuration points. We believe that Microsoft 365 is one of the greatest data leakage problems on planet Earth. And so what you want to do is you want to disable external sharing by default and then create processes by which people have to ask for exceptions to that default behavior. Disabling external group memberships, disabling external sway sharing, disable external calendar sharing. So it's interesting to us, we were doing a penetration test with one of our partners, and we were able to exfiltrate some very sensitive data because someone was publicly sharing their calendar, and in this organization, the culture was that they would attach documents to the calendar invite. And so if the calendar is allowed to be shared externally, and if someone has attached a sensitive document to that calendar invite, well, now you essentially have a public version of that sensitive data attached to the public calendar. You want to make sure you disable third-party app access by default. These are the apps that you can install from the Microsoft App Store, and disable LinkedIn account connections. Wait a second, my LinkedIn account can be linked? Yeah, so Microsoft owns LinkedIn now, and so you can actually bind the two together where you can have automatic updates between LinkedIn and the Microsoft 365 suite. Now, the next portion here, you want to make sure you reduce vulnerabilities with trust relationships to devices, and so you want to make sure you enable MFA for joining devices. If this is not enabled, then you will not be notified if someone tries to join a device on your behalf. So in the case of the global admin takeover that we had to clean up, they did not have this turned on, and that's why the attackers were able to essentially clone their Microsoft Authenticator on the attacker's iPhone. Let's talk a little bit about Exchange Online policies. So we've got, you want to make sure you blacklist malicious extensions. We've seen situations where Exchange Online is used for ransomware delivery inside of an organization because sometimes the email hygiene is only configured to watch for external delivery of ransomware and not necessarily internal delivery of ransomware. You want to make sure you do some attack surface reduction for Outlook Web Access. There's a text messaging API that's available inside of there that we've seen all sorts of fraudulent text messages sent through. Again, the LinkedIn contact sync should be disabled. Journaling, inbox rules, there's a whole bunch more that you can dig into there. Again, we could probably spend 30 minutes just on Exchange Online policies. But then also you want to make sure you got DMARC and DKIM core set up in your DNS and in your public-facing internet publish records, because DMARC and DKIM has become something that most of the email handlers are requiring now. And if you don't have it properly configured, there can be a lot of ways that your online domain can be used to try to phish other people, your customers, or your internal staff. And then a few additional points here. So SharePoint Online, you want to make sure that you've got really tight requirements around signing users out, verifying your time preferences. You want to disable Delve. Delve is a really interesting pivot point for attackers to basically go get access to information, stream it out somewhere else. You want to disable video media streaming services. We had one customer who, an enterprise employee, had set up a digital capture system to capture some college football games last year. And they were using the Azure Media Services to stream it, and they were charging people to watch the college football game. You want to make sure you stay away from that. Disabling personal blogs. We've seen some really interesting behavior where people are posting personal stuff on their corporate SharePoint blog, which by default is public. Not appropriate. You want to prevent users from running custom scripts and self-service created sites. And then you want to block SharePoint 2003 workflows. These are the old BizTalk workflows that date all the way back to the first days of XML version 1.0. And, we could go on and on here. So how do you think about assessing risks? And this is the way we break it down. You basically look at Azure AD, Exchange Online, Teams, Skype for Business, and then the Microsoft 365 cross-tenant settings. And then you move through these four sort of domains, right? You've got privilege management, attack surface reduction, service hardening, and transitive trust management. Then once you get that done for the baseline, then you start enumerating all of your SharePoint shares, your OneDrive shares, the Intune settings, and these are much more complex. So Azure AD, Exchange Online, they're fairly static. You can run that assessment once and essentially get a good idea of where you're at. Very little configuration drift in those. But when it comes to SharePoint, OneDrive, and Intune, lots of configuration drift, because people can stand up a SharePoint site that sometimes violates the overarching rules for the global tenant, depending upon what person's level of permissions are. And so this is the way that we break it out, to be able to look at these things. Now, when it comes to working through this, it can be difficult, and so what we've had to do, we've coded a series of scripts that combine Graph API calls, PowerShell, some Visual Studio tools, and we've bundled that together where we can be able to get a consistent return on those settings. And that's been the most of our development effort so far at Sirius, is actually going ahead and developing those tools to get consistent data feeds. So we often get a question, how do you prioritize these recommendations? Well, we use the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And so what we do is we work with partners around the world, research partners, to look into Azure AD and Microsoft 365 security incidents. And then we align the root causes of those incidents to the MITRE ATT&CK framework to understand, okay, was this privilege elevation? Was it a transitive trust problem? What was the actual root cause of what got them there? And so if we think about this, global admin privilege management, we've already sort of beat that one to death. Single sign-on protocol handling. Anyone who has turned on Azure AD in its default state has turned on the Azure AD P1 single sign-on stack. And what we're seeing happening right now is sophisticated attackers are sending emails to individuals that has a legitimate link, right? It's a link to what appears to be a legitimate site, but it is designed to basically serve as an OAuth token capture mechanism where the attacker will go capture the token, then replay that against a site that you may be using for single sign-on. So this is where you federated your identity between Azure AD and Salesforce, or Azure AD and Workday, or something like that. And so we're starting to see more and more of these single sign-on protocol attacks going on. And then transitive trust of data objects. And this is where if you do not properly limit the ownership of data when it comes to SharePoint and OneDrive, so by default, a data object that goes into SharePoint and OneDrive can be owned by the organization owner, but the receiving party, so let's say you invite someone like an outside lawyer or an outside business partner who's not part of your tenant, and they become a guest user. By default, the guest user can take ownership of an object and then share that according to their security policies. And that thereby creates the transitive trust problem. Well, if I trust him to do that, well, do I really trust him to do that? And so that's why you want to significantly limit the way that data objects can be taken ownership of from especially guest users. It looks like we've got another question here. Just do it. Oh, no. Okay, we're good. All right, so now, going to do a little pitch here, right? If you don't want to listen to this, I don't feel bad at all, but IANS and Sirius have come out with a reporting function that helps people to prioritize these 7,000 capabilities. And to provide some insight into why we're doing this, we actually had to develop some machine learning capabilities. So for example, if you take a look at the global admin problem with the hijack situation, what led to that was vulnerable iPhone, Microsoft Authenticator, and a global admin account that was misconfigured. Well, to look at those three things in a simple way with a simple script is fairly difficult. So what we've done is, using the AWS machine learning platform, is to go, let's enumerate all of the global admins. Bang, okay? Let's go enumerate all of the Intune data about the devices that are owned by those global admins. And so then we use machine learning to go and say, okay, this guy has an iPhone 4 and has a global admin account. Warning, that's not a good situation. And so, just to show a little bit about how we dig into things, the Microsoft 365 Security Center, they look at 12 different settings in Azure AD. The CIS M365 baseline looks at 16. We're looking at about 35 when it comes to just one aspect, which is the global admin stuff. So we've got just a few minutes left. If you want more information, if you're an IANS customer, you can reach out to IANS. If you're not an IANS customer, you can visit us at Sirix.tech. And so let's go ahead and open it up and see if there are any more questions. Any more questions from those attending? Don't be shy, folks. Unless you guys all have it figured out. I mean, if you have it figured out, maybe I should be asking you guys questions.
Well, Aaron, I don't see any more questions.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and just wrap it up then. So, so basically, here's the bottom line. If you're a Microsoft 365 customer, you've got some problems, right? And you need to start figuring out how you're going to go about doing that. If there's a way that you feel like you're out of your depth there, reach out to us, right? Especially if you're at a small business or nonprofit or an education institution, we're happy to help, you know, on a pro bono basis if for example, resources are an issue. And so, you know, what I would invite you to do is get to know some of these, especially in the Azure AD space. I mentioned that paper from Adam Chester. Highly recommend reading that. I think that's one of the most important things for anyone running Microsoft 365 to take a look at. So it's always a pleasure to be able to speak to the CornCon crowd. So if there's nothing else, I think we can end this one just a little bit early.
One more. Does P2 offer enough additional protection to make it worth it over P1?
Oh man, so you shouldn't think about P2 as a security benefit. P2 is actually just an expansion of the problem because you're inheriting a bunch of features. And so essentially what you've got to ask yourself is, number one, what is the integrity of my on-prem AD? And number two, what is the sophistication of my security team to understand the logs that are going to be coming in and out of that P2 environment? And so I don't think you should view P2 as an improvement of security benefits. It's actually complexity, right? How much stuff are you willing to do? Now, there are security benefits and security features that are built into P2, but if you're not sophisticated enough to manage P1, you probably aren't going to be sophisticated enough to manage P2 either. So that's where you have to ask yourself, are we really ready to get on the treadmill to get this done? All right, so I saw one come through in the chat. What is your advice to guys starting in this field? So you perhaps joined after the portion that I gave in the beginning, but I'll repeat it again. Be an expert in tech, right? Don't be an expert in security, be an expert in tech. Go and get to the nth level. So for example, if you're interested in Microsoft 365 security, then at that point, you need to go and read every single bit of documentation you can about the Graph API. You need to understand every nuance inside of the conditional access piece. You need to understand every single API that's available in SharePoint Online and Teams and all of that stuff. Be a great technologist and then apply cybersecurity principles on top of that great base of knowledge. So that would be my strongest recommendation here. Looks like we just had another one come through.
Two more in the Q&A.
Okay, so past the PRT attack, Mimikatz can extract cloud credentials from a logon session that can then be used in a browser for 14 days unless the associated account is disabled. Bypass MFA2. Yeah, so this is where you've got to have those settings done to make sure that you're not vulnerable to this kind of thing. And that's where you can harden your SSO stack to decrease the amount of time that your auth tokens are available for. And so you can start cranking that down. Now, the thing you have to be careful about when you start cranking that stuff down is that sometimes it will break legacy single sign-on integrations. And so that's where you've got to ask the question of your business, hey, you know, how tight do we want to tighten this down? And do we have a legacy anchor on our hands where we're essentially forced into using legacy single sign-on protocols that could open us up to a pass the refresh token, you know, type of attack? So yeah, let's just make sure anything else. Looks like we've got everything. All right. Well, we got 1 minute left. I'm going to go ahead and end a little bit early, but it's a pleasure speaking to the CornCon crowd. Any feedback or questions, go ahead and reach out to me through Sirix.tech or through my LinkedIn profile. Happy to help. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Okay, everyone left in track 2. We have a break until 12:30 with Dave Kennedy. So if you want to hop onto track 1, you can watch the keynote presentation from Malwarebytes. Thank you.